Tom Petty dies at 66, staple of rock radio with the Heartbreakers. Rocker Tom Petty died Monday after being rushed to a Los Angeles hospital, according to Tony Dimitriades, longtime manager of Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. Dimitriades confirmed Petty's death on behalf of the performer's family. He was 66. He suffered cardiac arrest at his home in Malibu in the early hours of this morning and was taken to UCLA Medical Center but could not be revived. He died peacefully at 8:40 p.m. PT, surrounded by family, his bandmates and friends, Dimitriades said in a statement. With his nasally voice and chiming guitar, Petty and his longtime band, the Heartbreakers, churned out an instantly recognizable brand of sturdy, heartland rock that made them a classic radio staple for decades. Petty, along with the band, was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2002. The group finished a summer tour with 3 performances at the Hollywood Bowl last week. Petty and the Heartbreakers first came to fame in the 1970s. It was both with that group and as a solo artist that Petty had a string of hits across the decades, including Free Fallin', American Girl and I Won't Back Down. Their 1976 debut contained a minor hit, Breakdown, but it wasn't until Petty's third album, Damn the Torpedoes, that he and the band broke through to the mainstream. That 1980 album won critical raves, went platinum and spawned the hits Don't Do Me Like That and Refugee. Petty sang with Stevie Nicks that same year on her smash hit, Stop Draggin' My Heart Around. The duet kicked off a long and fruitful period of collaboration between Petty and other artists. He recorded Don't Come Around Here No More, memorable for its trippy, Mad Hatter-themed music video, with Eurythmics' Dave Stewart. In 1985, Petty joined Bob Dylan on tour the next year, which also included dates with the Grateful Dead. He joined fellow music legends Dylan, George Harrison, Jeff Lynne, and Roy Orbison in 1988 to form the Traveling Wilburys. They released 2 studio albums, Related, Heartbroken, The Music World. Fans react to Tom Petty's death. It was a rich career for Petty, who was born in Gainesville, Florida and became hooked on rock and roll when, at the age of 11, he met superstar Elvis Presley on a movie set. Petty joined his first band, the Sundowners, in high school at the age of 14. After getting into an argument with the band's drummer, Petty quit and moved on to join a group called the Epics, which included Tom Ledden, a brother of Eagles guitarist Bernie Ledden. We realized Tom was the real musician of the band, their fellow band member Rick Rucker told the Orlando Sentinel in 2006. The Epics later changed their name to Mudcrutch, and Petty traveled to Los Angeles in search of a record deal for the rock quintet. Despite landing a deal, the group soon disbanded. A new group that included Petty and 2 former Mudcrutch members formed in 1975, eventually becoming known as Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. After pioneering the heartland rock sound, Petty went solo in 1989 before regrouping with the Heartbreakers 3 years later. He also found fame as an actor. His flair for drama was on display in his music videos for songs like Mary Jane's Last Dance. Petty starred with Kevin Costner in the 1997 film, The Postman. He also had a recurring role as the voice of Elroy Lucky Kleinschmidt in the animated comedy series, King of the Hill. A 2015 biography on Petty documented a dark turn for the singer and his struggle with heroin addiction in 1997, following the collapse of his 20-year marriage and a failed album. Tried to go cold turkey, and that wouldn't work, Petty said in the book. It's an ugly effing thing. Petty told CNN in a 2007 interview that he loved music as much as it loved him. Music, as far as I have seen in the world so far, is the only real magic that I know, he said. There is something really honest and clean and pure and it touches you in your heart. Tom Petty, a songwriter who melded California rock with a deep, stubborn Southern heritage, died on Monday after suffering cardiac arrest. He was 66 and had lived in Los Angeles. Tony Dimitriades, Mr. Petty's longtime manager, confirmed the death. Recording with the Heartbreakers, the band he formed in the mid-1970s, and on his own, Mr. Petty wrote pithy, hard-headed songs that gave a contemporary clarity to 1960s roots. His voice was grainy and unpretty, with the Florida drawl that he proudly displayed. Mr. Petty's songs were staples of FM rock radio through decades, and with hits like Refugee, Don't Come Around Here No More, Free Fallin' and Into the Great Wide Open. Mr. Petty sold millions of albums and headlined arenas and festivals well into 2017. He played the Super Bowl halftime show in 2008 and entered the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2002, but his songs stayed down to earth, with sturdy guitar riffs carrying lyrics that spoke for underdogs and ordinary outcasts. In his 1989 hit, I Won't Back Down, he sang, "You can stand me up at the gates of hell, but I won't back down." Mr. Petty's songwriting was shaped by the music he heard growing up, the ringing folk rock guitars of the Byrds, the crunch of the Rolling Stones, the caustic insights of Bob Dylan, the melodic turns of the Beatles, the steadfast backbeat of Southern soul and the twang of country rock. On stage, the Heartbreakers sometimes expanded songs toward psychedelia-tinged jams. Mr. Petty's songs were staples of FM rock radio through decades, and with hits like Refugee, Don't Come Around Here No More, Free Fallin' and Into the Great Wide Open, Mr. Petty sold millions of albums and headlined arenas and festivals well into 2017. He played the Super Bowl halftime show in 2008 and entered the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2002, but his songs stayed down to earth, with sturdy guitar riffs carrying lyrics that spoke for underdogs and ordinary outcasts. In his 1989 hit, I Won't Back Down, he sang, "You can stand me up at the gates of hell, but I won't back down." Mr. Petty's songwriting was shaped by the music he heard growing up, the ringing folk rock guitars of the Byrds, the crunch of the Rolling Stones, the caustic insights of Bob Dylan, the melodic turns of the Beatles, the steadfast backbeat of Southern soul and the twang of country rock. On stage, the Heartbreakers sometimes expanded songs toward psychedelia-tinged jams, but across styles, Mr. Petty kept his songwriting tight-lipped, succinct and evocative. She was an American girl, raised on promises, he sang on Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers' 1976 debut album. She couldn't help thinking that there was a little more to life somewhere else. There was scrappy defiance in both his lyrics and his career choices. "I turn anger into ambition," he told one interviewer. "Any sort of injustice would outrage me. I couldn't contain myself." In the late 1980s, Mr. Petty teamed up with some of his elders and influences to form the Traveling Wilburys, writing and recording with Mr. Dylan, George Harrison, Jeff Lynne and Roy Orbison. With his death, only Mr. Dylan and Mr. Lynne survived from that group. Mr. Orbison died in 1988 and Mr. Harrison in 2001. Mr. Dylan responded immediately to reports of Mr. Petty's death with a statement, "It's shocking, crushing news. I thought the world of Tom. He was a great performer, full of the light, a friend, and I'll never forget him." But for more than 40 years, Mr. Petty made music with the Heartbreakers, who started officially in 1976 in Los Angeles but grew out of Mudcrutch, the band Mr. Petty joined as a teenager in his hometown, Gainesville, Florida. Through decades of performing, Mr. Petty and the Heartbreakers steered clear of elaborate showmanship to let their songs and their musicianship speak for themselves. Thomas Earl Petty was born October 20, 1950, in Warren Zanes's Petty, the biography, Macmillan, 2015. Mr. Petty recalled a rough childhood with frequent beatings by his father. He did poorly in school, but turned to music, getting his first guitar in 1962 and soon, under the influence of the Beatles, growing long hair and switching to electric guitar. He joined his first band, the Sundowners, in the mid-1960s, and was soon gigging around Gainesville. Mudcrutch, which got started in 1970, included the guitarist Mike Campbell and the keyboardist Ben Montench, who would become mainstays of the Heartbreakers. It built a large local following in Florida, got a recording contract with Shelter Records and relocated to Los Angeles. But the label lost confidence in the band and dropped it, keeping only Mr. Petty under contract. In 1974, Mr. Petty married his first wife, Jane Banyo. Mr. Petty tried recording with session musicians, but preferred a steady band. He formed the Heartbreakers in late 1975 with Mr. Campbell, Mr. Tench and other musicians from Gainesville, Stan Lynch on drums and Ron Blair on bass. "I think we made the most of not knowing what the hell we were doing," Mr. Petty said in Mr. Zane's biography. The band's 1976 debut album, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, made little impact until a tour of England put the album on the British charts. Then the single Breakdown made its way onto American radio, reaching number 40 on the top 40. Roger McGuinn of the Brits recorded his own version of the Brit-style American Girl. But Mr. Petty had signed away 100% of his publishing rights to Shelter for a $10,000 annual advance on royalties. He wanted to renegotiate. He won rights to 50% of future publishing royalties after the release of a fourth album. The band's second album, You're Gonna Get It, in 1978, included the singles Listen to Her Heart and I Need to Know. Another contract dispute followed after the ownership of Shelter changed. Mr. Petty sued Shelter's new parent label, MCA, and declared bankruptcy, ending up in a legal limbo that delayed his next album until a new deal was reached. I like to devote my time and energy to being a musician, he told the New York Times in 1981. But sometimes there's a communications breakdown and, when that happens, you just have to stand up for yourself. When it was eventually released in late 1979, Damn the Torpedoes was a blockbuster. With the singles Don't Do Me Like That and Refugee, the album reached number 2 on the Billboard album chart and sold more than 3 million copies. That led to the next impasse, when MCA planned to make Mr. Petty's next album a flagship of what it called superstar pricing, $9.98 rather than $8.98. Mr. Petty, among other tactics, threatened to title it the $8.98 album, and the price did not rise. MCA has done a great job selling our records, but they couldn't see the reality of what it's like on the street, Mr. Petty said in 1981. They couldn't see that raising the album's price wouldn't be fair. Through the 1980s, Mr. Petty and the Heartbreakers maintained a steady cycle of recording and touring, including a performance at the Live Aid concert broadcast worldwide in 1985. Their hit singles included You Got Lucky and Don't Come Around Here No More. Mr. Petty also had a hit duet with Stevie Nicks, Stop Draggin' My Heart Around. He and the Heartbreakers had million-selling albums with Hard Promises in 1981, Let Me Up, I've Had Enough, in 1987 and Into the Great Wide Open in 1991, as well as Southern Accents in 1985. Complacency did not set in. At one point during mixing sessions for Southern Accents, an album intended to examine Mr. Petty's Southern roots, a frustrated Mr. Petty punched the wall so hard he severely fractured his left hand. In 1986, Mr. Petty and the Heartbreakers played a 60-concert world tour with Bob Dylan, performing their own songs and then backing up Mr. Dylan. The Traveling Wilburys were initially convened by Mr. Harrison, but their songs turned into jovial rockers with tag-team vocals on the two Traveling Wilburys albums that were released in 1988 and 1990. In another notable collaboration, Mr. Petty and most of the Heartbreakers backed Johnny Cash on his 1996 album, Unchained. Full Moon Fever, released in 1989, was billed as a Tom Petty solo album, recorded with members of both the Heartbreakers and the Traveling Wilburys. With the top 10 hit Free Fallin', it became Mr. Petty's most popular album, selling 5 million copies in the United States alone. A second nominally solo album, Wildflowers in 1994, had Mr. Petty backed by most of the Heartbreakers. It, too, was a multi-million seller, with the hit You Don't Know How It Feels. But Wildflowers, Mr. Petty said in the biography, was also the harbinger of his divorce from Miss Bainio in 1996. Living alone, Mr. Petty fell into a heroin addiction that he overcame through rehab before his 2001 marriage to Dana York. Mr. Petty's productivity briefly slowed, but never stopped. He recorded one of the starkest Heartbreakers albums, Echo, which was released in 1999 and reached the top 10. Mr. Petty mocked a corporate-dominated music business on The Last DJ with the Heartbreakers in 2002, and continued to make albums with the Heartbreakers through Nobody's Children in 2015. Their 2014 album, Hypnotic Eye, reached number 1 on the Billboard album chart, a testimonial to fans' lingering loyalty in an era of diminished disc sales. Mr. Petty's music also reached a younger generation, as he headlined the Bonnaroo Music Festival in 2006 and 2013. "We're one of those old, lucky bands," he told Rolling Stone in 2013. "Young people come to see us. It makes a difference." In 2013, Mr. Petty and the Heartbreakers played extended residencies at the Beacon Theatre in New York and the Fonda Theatre in Los Angeles, reaching well past their hits. Mr. Petty regularly delved into his music collection with the SiriusXM radio show, Tom Petty's Buried Treasure, that he began in 2005. Mr. Petty circled back to his beginnings as he reformed Mudcrutch, with Mr. Tench and Mr. Campbell along with the founding Mudcrutch members Tom Ledden and Randall March, to make a belated debut album and tour in 2007, followed by a second album and tour in 2016. Mr. Petty toured with the Heartbreakers for much of this year. His wife survives him along with Mr. Petty's brother, Bruce, his daughters, Audria and Anna Kim, his stepson, Dylan Petty, and a grandchild. Mr. Petty's songs repeatedly proved their durability. A 1993 collection of greatest hits, including the single Mary Jane's Last Dance, stayed on the Billboard album chart for 6 years. The campaigns of Michelle Bachmann and George W. Bush received cease and desist letters to deter them from playing Mr. Petty's songs at campaign events. And in 2015, Sam Smith belatedly realized that the chorus of his hit Stay With Me had all too much in common with I Won't Back Down, written by Mr. Petty and Mr. Lynn. He quickly shared the songwriting credit. "A musical accident, no more no less," Mr. Petty wrote in a typically laconic statement. "In these times we live in, this is hardly news.